AEW Fight Forever is the first of apparently a TV wrestling brand that I've never even heard of. I stopped watching WWE and the like 15 years ago. And AEW is basically built around people all around the world that think they're elite enough to be wrestlers. So basically they get signed in, all of these random people among superstars of the wrestling brands, and everybody has their shot. So the very first wrestling video game for this brand, AEW Fight Forever, released. Is it worth the money? Is it worth the value? Is it worth the time? Stay tuned, here we go. The story in AEW Fight Forever revolves around something called Road to Elite. Basically, you go through an entire year's worth of a pre-selected character from AEW, Sting, Christian Cage, and many others, and you spend an entire year going through the ranks of the Road to Elite, making matches, working out, flying here to there, and eating out, dining, having fun, getting championships. All of that is along the way to the Elite within the Road to Elite. Now, for me, honestly, I couldn't really finish the story mode even with one character because I went through 7 or 8 matches, so about 7 or 8 chapters of Road to Elite, and the entire story is built around the exact same structure for the story. You get announced as a new character, a new wrestler in the league. You're set to face off with this person, which is fine. And that takes you up the ranks if you win, takes you down the ranks if you lose. And there's always a different part of the story, depending on your wins and losses in this game for the story. The thing I really did not like about AEW Fight Forever's Road to Elite is how so very generic, so very annoying, so very repetitious the storytelling and structure of this is. So right from the get-go, right from the beginning, all the way to most likely the end of it, you're set on a weekly or monthly basis preparing for your next matchup. Okay, that's fine. You get to choose what to do, whether it be work out, eat out, have fun, go snap some photos of the state that you're in. Sounds pretty fun and riveting, right? Well, the thing I liked about it was, especially when you're working out, you could potentially injure yourself depending on the injury percentage for what could happen. That's one thing I really liked about it. What I didn't like is that you only got so many options to do these outside things, these outside events and activities with outside of wrestling. And there are so few of them, and they're throughout the entire career. It's basically 3 to 4 different activities that you can do outside of wrestling matches. I like the structure. I like the premise of going week to week. Each week has its own individual thing where you can choose to work out or go out. I like that structure of the story. I didn't like how little of options we actually had for the story structure, the events, the activities. It seems like a bit at first, and then you go through a couple weeks or a couple months or a couple matches later, and you realize you're doing the exact same goddamn thing throughout the entire story. Now, the story itself isn't terrible. I mean, Road to Elite is literally taking your guy from ground zero rank up to the major leagues, and that's fine. It's everything within that, all of the components within that just doesn't really match well with what they were trying to do. They were trying to think big, on a big scale for what they could do with the story, which is fine for a wrestling game. Honestly, I'm impressed that they did as much as they did for a wrestling game story. I really am impressed by that, but they lack so much that they don't realize. They did a lot for a basic standalone game as a good starting basis, but that's really all it is. It's just a good startup game for the story, at least. The story Overall, for the story, it's generic, it's basic, it's going through the motions, and that's it. The combat or gameplay in AEW Fight Forever, set aside all of the events and activities that you can do in the story modes, the gameplay itself, I like it to an extreme fault. I like how simplistic it is. I like how it feels arcadey again, much like WWE's Here Comes the Pain and the like that. And I understand a lot of people don't like that kind of gameplay in wrestling games. I like a lot of wrestling games, and they're all different. They're varied. AEW Fight Forever is kind of like a mix between Here Comes the Pain and TNA Impact, but even more basic than TNA Impact. The character, the roster selection, the gameplay and combat, everything about it is so simplistic. Now, it's not bad. It's honestly pretty good because of how simplistic it is, but they could have done so much more with the gameplay. I understand this is the very first AEW game to ever release, and like I said in the story part, this is a good startup game. I don't really have many complaints if I were to look at this game as a good startup video game franchise. But otherwise, outside of that, the gameplay and combat definitely needs a lot of tweaks in it if it wants a lot more replayability, because honestly, every match felt the exact same. Whether it be a standard match or even a TLC match, it all felt the same. Even a TLC match, it plays the exact same as a standard match, set aside being able to press a button and pick up an object and hit them with it twice and then it disappears. Which on top of that, the gameplay, the intuitive controls in the video game's combat, they don't really pick up when you prompt a button. For example, you could be walking over to a sledgehammer, press the button, and like 75% of the time, you're not even picking the weapon up or anything, any object. So I think they really need to mess around a lot with the controls, a lot with the sensitivity. They need to put a lot more tweaks into the gameplay itself. But for a basic startup game, good gameplay. For basic starting point. The audio in AEW Fight Forever, I didn't really have many gripes for the audio. I thought it all sounded fine. There weren't any hiccups. There weren't any hooks. There weren't any sound drops or anything. The commentary sounded fine. The entrances sounded great, honestly. Even the gameplay's audio sounded fine, although I would say that was the worst part of the audio, just because it didn't sound as appropriately tuned as like the entrances or the commentations, which the entrances and the commentary actually really good, very well done for the audio. The visuals of AEW Fight Forever are that of PS2 era visuals. They're not terrible, but they are nowhere near up to snuff as today's standards for PS5 video games. It doesn't look terrible. It actually runs smoothly and fine, but I believe that's because the hardware that you play AEW Fight Forever on doesn't really take much to power this game. This game's engine, everything just looks so outdated. At the very least, I would say this is a very mediocre looking game. It gets the job done. You can see the character models, you can see the ring layout, you can see the entrance layout, you can see the fireworks. It looks okay. It doesn't look terrible, but there's absolutely nothing about this game's visuals that really pop out to you. And on top of that, the biggest thing I would say is my biggest gripe for this game, and I get that I just said the audio is fine, but half the time at the very least, there isn't even voiceover. You just have to read subtitles. I hate that. We're in 2023. There should absolutely be no time in any video game where there is no voiceover unless you change it to that or you change the subtitles to be turned on while the voiceover is happening. Absolutely no excuse for that whatsoever. Overall, for me, AEW Fight Forever is not a terrible game. This is actually a pretty good startup video game for an up-and-coming series, and I honestly hope that they do more in the future for this brand. I just really wish they add so much more into the future of this video game series. Overall, for me, AEW Fight Forever is a 5 out of 10. It's not terrible, but it's nowhere near great. It's not that great. It's not really even that good. It's okay at best, but it's not a terrible game. It's a good startup wrestling game, and I do applaud their efforts for making this game, although the applause is very short. They could have done so much more, even for this being a startup game. They could have done so much more. They could have written it so much better. So 5 out of 10, AEW Fight Forever. Thank you.